Okay, well, hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today in this Free Training Friday. Got an exciting topic, tips and tricks for using projects. My name is Philip Ferris. I'm the Director of Education here at Abacus Next and a Office Tools expert, or at least I like to think so. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining me. Just to be clear, this is not necessarily a projects training. Again, this is more about the little things that we might miss day to day that can be very helpful when working with projects. Some may be a little bit more advanced, so if you're new to projects, this may be a little outside of your wheelhouse just yet, but it's still good to know. And if you're a beginning user, again, I'm going to put some things in there for you also. So we got a lot of stuff to cover. About 20 minutes or so, we're going to talk about projects. I want to leave about 10 minutes or so at the end for some Q&A. So if you have questions, you can type those into the questions area of the GoToWebinar panel at any time, and I'll do my best to answer those at the end of the webinar. Before I really jump in, though, I want to do an audio check. If anybody listening, if you can hear me, if you don't mind, if you could just type into the questions or chat area or raise your hand using the GoToWebinar panel, that would be very, very helpful to let me know that my audio is coming in okay. Sounds good. Thank you very much for the input. Really appreciate it. Okay, so a couple things we're going to talk about today. Again, having to deal with projects, but we're going to keep it down to the tips and tricks and kind of the little things. But before we get going, I'm going to ask a very self-serving polling question to everybody, if you don't mind, and that's really about what areas of Office Tools would you like to see more webinars of in the future? We're always adapting these. We're always changing these things to make sure that we're fulfilling needs as far as content. So if everybody doesn't take a moment, if you don't mind, just check one of the boxes as far as what kind of categories of Office Tools related webinars would you like to see more of in the future. That way, obviously, we can trim and kind of format the curriculum to match what everybody's looking for. And I'll let this run just a moment, give everybody an opportunity to cue in here. Well, it looks like time and billing, well, it's kind of split pretty evenly across everything. Apparently nobody really cares about CRM and scheduling, though. A lot of other great stuff. We'll just go for just a moment. Okay, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and pull that poll down. Thank you, everybody, for helping with that. Really, really appreciate it. So a couple of things that we're going to talk about today in relations to projects and kind of tips and tricks-ish stuff. Are going to be assignments and checklists. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some budgets. All right. Pre-assigning work, pre-assigning staff. It's an important thing. It doesn't come up all of the time, but when needed, it can be very, very helpful. And also about project events. This comes up pretty often. There's a lot of things that can connect to a project, like a phone call, for example. I want to make sure that everybody understands how they can track those things. And then a very common question is, what's the difference between a project and a to-do? Well, we're going to talk about that. And then finally, how do we handle all of those projects on our list? All those red lines and the potentially hundreds of items that are going to show up the middle of March or beginning of April, whatever it may be. How do we deal with those things? So we're going to talk about all these subjects here as we go through. And again, at any point, if you have a question, type it in. Again, I'll do my best to kind of look at the questions area as we go and see if I can insert the answer in the presentation here. But I will leave some time at the end to go over all of the questions. So if you got something, please ask. I'll be more than happy to cover it. Okay, let's just jump right in. Let's get started here. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is assignments versus checklist, or kind of what the differences between those two things are. So if you've used projects at all, I'm sure you understand the idea that each project is going to have its own defined workflow, right? The steps within that project that you track and you assign to people as the work comes in. They complete their part of it and they assign it to the next person and so on and so on. Well, in addition to that, projects also have checklists, and you can see a checklist for a project over in the right corner, in the top right corner of the project screen. Now, this checklist for a project can be built ahead of time, so each project definition will actually have its own checklist. Now, what I've seen happen in the past with offices, especially as they first start to roll Office Tools out, is they fall back on kind of their own methodologies. They reference their routing sheets and their dockets and their travelers and all those things, and and they kind of build what they think is going to be their workflow, but they build it in the checklist. In some other examples, some offices will take what they've had in the past that are checklist type items, and they'll actually build that into their workflow as an assignment. And that can cause some problems. And the reason that can be a problem is because when you're assigning work to somebody, you're effectively telling them, hey, here's work for you to do, and here are the details of that work. A checklist is more of an acknowledgement that something has occurred. And you want to separate those two things as best you can. There are some gray areas. I would use missing info as a gray area. It's one of those things that you want to acknowledge when you receive some missing documentation. So it's kind of an acknowledgement, right? But it's also an actionable item. We can bug the client to bring the stuff in. So there are some gray areas, but you really want to think about how and what items you're putting in the project workflow as an assignment and what type of items land on checklists. If I open up the checklist here for this project that you see on the screen, I really only have one item, which is received info. And while that may be a little odd of a checklist item, I'm trying to magnify the type of thing that's going to go in here. Something that is not necessarily actionable, but more of a logging of information is where you're going to want to have checklist items. The fact that you have sent something or received something. Usually outside forces like the client have influenced the need to track something. They've delivered something to you, and you're acknowledging that fact. What you don't want to do is have something on your activity list. You don't want to have an assignment or give an assignment to somebody that they can't do. Right? Telling somebody, hey, I need you to receive the 8879 is a little odd. That's not really up to the staff member necessarily. Sure, they can call the client and there's an argument there. But just keep in mind that there are two different things going on here. The assignments within the workflow are actionable tasks, as where checklists are more reactionary logs. Okay, so pick your battles on those. At the end of the day, whatever works for you is what's good. But those are the two kind of ways they interact. Another thing to keep in mind about checklists is you really can't do a lot with them. You can't track time from a checklist item. The reporting for checklists are minimal. And there are reports, project reports, that do show checklists, but they're sparse. And really all you get is the acknowledgement that something was checked off on a certain date by a certain staff member. If you really want to unlock the power of checklist, however, there is one thing that you can do. There is an option located, and I know this might seem like an odd area, but just follow me here, under the Setup menu, My Company, Information and Settings. I'll give everybody a moment to jot this down if you're interested in using checklists. And what this setting is going to do, and it's located under the Contacts tab down here on this screen. What this setting will do is actually lock down your checklist, or I should say the completion of your work based on the completion of the checklist. Therefore, if you put 5 things in your project checklist, such as received a signed engagement letter, received the e-file documents, that we received payment, perhaps even if we want to get creative, but if we put things on our checklist that we are requiring to be done or at least acknowledged prior to the completion of our project, this will protect us from that. If I attempt to complete my work without having checked off my checklist items, it'll actually give me a prompt and say, sorry, you didn't do these things, or you haven't acknowledged these checklist items, therefore you can't complete your project. That really makes checklists far, far more powerful. But you can't assign checklist items, you can't put due dates on them, anything like that. So use them sparingly, and that's kind of the difference between assignments and checklists. So going a little further, the next thing I want to talk about is our assignment budgets, and kind of in the same vein, project budgets. So if you're using project budgets or you're planning on it, here's something to keep in mind. There are really 2 places where you can manage these details. One of them is on the main project itself. So for my example of my 2016, I know it's kind of old, my tax return project that I have here on the screen, if you follow the mouse down, you can actually see in the bottom left corner I have some budgeted hours. All right, I've budgeted about 12 hours and I've tracked about 3. So I'm about a quarter of the way through my project. So this is the project budget, this 12 hours right here. And that's one way to do it. And it's very straightforward. It's very simple to track, and it kind of gives you a ballpark number. You can also actually open up the work list budget at the top of the screen here and create or view budget items specific to each assignment. So you could, in theory, come in here and actually put a budget on each step, or as you're assigning these assignments, put a budget in there. But here's something I want you to keep in mind. You can't have both. Well, you can have both, but you can't have them be different numbers. And here's what I mean. The project budget, if all I did was come into the project and edit this number and make this 10 hours, that's fine. But if I then also go into the work list budget and then create a 1 hour review budget, my budget is actually going to update and show 1 hour. And the reason for that is because the total of the assignment budgets will actually override the total project budget. Which makes sense, right? If you have 5 assignments and they're 2 hours each, that's 10 hours worth of work. Your project has 10 hours worth of budget. So the thing to keep in mind, the easiest way to think about this is your budget's going to come from your assignments first, and if there is no budget for those assignments, then you can simply just put in a project budget here. But you can't do both. You can't have 10 hours of project budget, but only assign 5 hours of assignment-specific budgets. So if you notice this number keeps changing, or it's just not what you're expecting, or if you're wondering how did that number even get there, it's because you have budget items associated to specific assignments. You can view those in the work list, and you can see those actually when you actually assign work. You can see those right down here, estimated hours for research, or whatever the assignment may be. So I wanted to bring that up because I do have offices that struggle with that a little bit, where they want to have a total project budget of a certain number, but the only real work they care about as far as a budget goes is these 1 or 2 steps. Well, again, we can't do both. So pick your battles on that one. If you're not using project budgets, then I would just start right here. Just put in what you feel it's going to be. Typically, after that first one, you're going to want to reference the previous, right? So maybe the first time you set up a project budget, it's a guesstimation. Well, next year or next period, whenever that project rolls over, it can carry that budget with it, and you'll see the last period amount. So you'll know what the previous year was and what you may want to adjust it to this year. Very cool things there, so you can fiddle around with that, but keep in mind you have either a project total or your assignment budgets, and you have to pick one of those two. Okay, in that same area, let's talk a little bit about pre-assigning. This comes up quite a bit. If we look at this project in the top right corner, we can see that it's currently actually assigned to input and prep, and it's assigned to the staff member Joe Demo. I know it may be small on everybody's screens, but this particular project it's already been assigned. The first step is already out. If we go to Joe Demo's activity list down here on the bottom, we can obviously see the reminder that reflects that assignment, and the work is being done. But the situation will come up that when Joe completes input and prep, and I'll go ahead and do that here, when Joe checks off input and prep, the system's going to then ask him to track his time and then to assign it to the next person. Right? Well, what if Joe doesn't know who that next person is? Or what if it's not Joe's decision? Or what if we just want to make sure that the next step goes to a certain person? Maybe it's because of the client, right? And we want to relieve Joe of having to make that decision. Well, what you can actually do, and I'll cancel this so that assignment comes back, is you can go into the work list ahead of time, and you can create an assignment without an assigned date. And what that's basically telling OfficeTools is, look, when it gets to review, I would like this person to do it. I don't know when that's going to be because Joe still has to do the prep, but when it gets there and when Joe's done with his part and we're moving it to the next step, here's what I've decided I want to do with the next step. You can't do this globally. This is on a per project level. But I could, for example, come into this tax return. I can open up the work list here. And this is more of a little trick. But I can come into the work list budget, open this guy up. I think I already actually have it open. There we go. And up at the top, and we can see the current assignment. So we can see that Joe Demo has input and prep. I can actually come up here to the plus button, hit plus, and instead of adding an assignment, because an assignment would be actually giving somebody work right now. I don't want to do that. I'm actually going to add a budget. And I know we think budgets in our head as far as numbers and hours and dollars and things of that sort, but what we're actually going to do is budget the next step and the next person who's going to do it. maybe we actually put an hour amount on that. But all we have to do here is actually say, when this assignment comes up, we'll say review, that we've predetermined that Sally is going to do the review. Say OK, and we're done. It's in the system, it's logged, but you'll notice there's no assign date for Sally's review job. The reason being is because Joe's not done with his, therefore we don't know when it's actually going to get assigned. But here's the cool part, here's what happens. When Joe does complete his job, his input and prep step, he checks it off of his list, okay, time card pops up, and although I skipped a step down to review, once it does get to review, it will auto-populate Sally's name. So that's a very cool way of preloading potential assignments and stats for those assignments. So it's a very, very helpful kind of thing to do. And you can do that again if you want to actually put hours on that step. You can go ahead and do that. But it's, again, a very convenient way of saying, for this project, when it gets here, and we don't know when that's going to be, but when it gets to this assignment, here's what we want to do with it. And I do see some questions coming through, and again, I will get to the questions. I don't want you to think I'm ignoring those. Okay, so we talked a little bit about projects and a little bit about checklists and workflow and assignments and that kind of stuff, but what about the out-of-scope work? Right, we'd be silly to think that the project is the end-all be-all of everything that we touch for this client. A lot of things happen outside of that. And to piggyback on top of the budgets, if we're expecting 10 hours of work for this project, yet we spend 2 or 3 hours on the phone with the client every week, that might be an important part of our budgeting, or at least an important part of our billing decisions, or maybe it'd just be good to know. And the way OfficeTools is set up, that everything is connected to the client, this gives us a really unique opportunity to start connecting these dots. So on the project screen over on the right side, although I feel it's pretty obvious, a lot of people do miss it, there's a little link that says project events. And in my example here, you can see that it's actually a green color. So just like the checklist, it actually lights up when there's data there. If my checklist was gray, or if the project events words were gray, what that's telling me is there's nothing else. There's no phone calls, there's no appointments, there's no to-dos, there's nothing else connected outside back into this project. However, in this example, it's lit up green. So if I click on it, I can actually see what else has been connected to this project. Okay, it looks like we made some phone calls, and there's a couple other things that we did for the client in the context of this work. So it's out of scope, it's those little things that just kind of pop up that we can't really account for. It's not part of our traditional workflow, but nonetheless we want to track it and not lose sight of these items. If we track time for them, then that will actually also affect our project budget. And the easiest way to make this happen is that when you are doing things that are related to a project in other places within OfficeTools, just choose the project from the project dropdown, and you'll see it. So if I jump over to the Calls tab, we can see that there's actually a drop-down menu here for a project. So if a client called, I could go ahead and create a brand new phone call, put in the details of what I want to track, and I can just hit the drop-down for that project, choose the appropriate project that I want to associate this call to, and now all the time that I track and the details that I put in here are available from that project screen. And that's very helpful in conjunction with budgets also, because now you can start to see what's really going on as far as the work goes when you're tracking these things. So project events are very, very handy. Again, doesn't require any extra work. All you got to do is associate things to the projects as appropriate. Okay, to-dos versus projects. This is a longer discussion, but I'm going to give you the simplest way of thinking about, is something a to-do or is something a project? And there is a gray area, but we'll leave that out. We'll leave that to you and your OfficeTools trainers as you discuss your needs. But here's the easiest way to think about it. If it's one person doing one job one time, it's a to-do. It's the simplest way to think about it. If it's multiple people doing multiple steps over a period of time, it's a project. And that's going to nail 99% of all the scenarios that come up. If Joe is working on something and he then needs to pass it over to Bob, that's a project. But if Joe's the only person who touches it, and Joe only does it every now and then, and when he's done, then that's a to-do. So those are the two main differences between to-dos and projects. That doesn't, however, mean you can't have single-step projects. and it doesn't mean you can't have to-dos that reoccur on a regular basis. But again, those are the exceptions, not the rule. One person, one job, one time, that's a to-do. Multiple people, multiple steps over a period of time, that's a project. And the last thing I'm gonna bring up here as far as the tips and tricks for projects is really about the activity list, and projects are a big part of this particular thing. And that's what appears on our list on the bottom, on the activity list on the bottom. I imagine that anybody who's listening right now who's a long-time OfficeTools user, or even if you're relatively recent, or you've gone through a tax season, I guess is a better way of saying it, your list might look a little bit more like, a little bit like this, right? Where it's just line after line after line of projects, most of which you can't do anything about right now. You have to wait another month or two, if not longer. So how do we make projects not just kind of dump all the information on our list and make it an entire mess? The easiest way for me to describe what you can do here as a little trick is to create a fictitious staff member. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're actually going to create a new staff member in OfficeTools. It doesn't affect your licensing because they're not a real person. They're never going to use OfficeTools. But you're going to create a staff person and give them a name. I've seen creative names like Smokey the Bear or whoever. And then you assign the projects that don't have a home to that login. And I've actually done that here. If I come down to the bottom left corner under staff, I can come down here to assigned prep. I know it's not a very creative name, but I'm sure you get the idea. And inside this list are all of the projects and all of the assignments that don't have a home yet. The client hasn't come into the office yet or dropped off their work. There's a bunch of stuff sitting in the prep bucket or the review folder, and I'm waiting for somebody to grab them. And what this does is it relieves everybody's activity list from all of this stuff until such time as they come into this assigned prep list, which everybody will have access to. They see something they want to grab off the shelf, they can click on it and they can assign it to themselves. So what you're doing is you're creating a bucket for all of your project reminders, your assignments to go into if you don't know who they're supposed to go to yet, and it gives you a second activity list, so to speak, that you can put things into and actively go and retrieve and assign as needed. So that's one way of getting 300 tax return projects off of your list, but still not losing sight of them and being able to track them. Okay, perfect. So I know some questions are going through here. Looks like we've got about 8 minutes for questions. Hopefully that's enough time. If you have more questions or I went too fast through something or you want to see it again, now's a great time to type that in. There is a questions field, a questions box located in the GoToWebinar panel. Give me just a second. I'm going to go ahead and read some of these real quick and just have a look here. Okay, so Connie asked, Connie's very active in the questions. I appreciate it, Connie. Can you have a checklist at the assignment level that they can't complete assignments without completing it? And yes, Connie, you absolutely can. It's a little trickier. It requires a little bit more setup. But basically what Connie's saying, if you didn't get that from the question there, is can I have an assignment like review or prep or e-file or whatever it may be with a specific checklist just for that step? And they can't complete their step until they complete their checklist. And yes, Connie, you absolutely can. To set that up, what you want to do is go to the Setup menu at the top. All right, you want to go into Projects, and you want to go down to the Project Assignment Groups. This is where you build your workflow for your projects, right? If anybody who's done the Setup component in OfficeTools, this will be a very familiar area. At the top, you choose your project. So in this example, it would be my 1040. And over on the right, I have my workflow. These are the steps that I track when I do this particular project. And you'll notice just to the right of this list, there's a checklist. So if I had very specific things that I wanted to track for review, as an example, I could select review on the right here, open up the checklist, and begin choosing what items I would like on that checklist. Therefore, when that was assigned to somebody, if they didn't check it off, they can't complete their step. But be careful with that because that can be a little heavy, a little heavy-handed. So choose your battles, but yes, you can absolutely do that. Another question here about remembering assignments for the next year. I imagine that this is in the context of assigning work ahead of time. There are options to have projects use the previous year's staff. However, that requires you to use a different version of a project. By default, most projects are going to fall into what we call sequential, meaning step 1, then step 2, then step 3. However, you can go into the setup, and I'd recommend that you talk to a trainer about this for more detail, but you can choose a concurrent style workflow for a project. And in doing that, what you're able to accomplish is predetermining every step of the project. And if you do that, then every subsequent year or period will retain those values. So in theory, yes, you could have next year's project have the same people as the previous year. The problem with that is when work gets assigned and when things are due. Because just because Joe completed the review on Tuesday of this year does not mean that that's going to make sense next year. But there are some options. Talk to a trainer and they can clarify that for you. Okay. So another question here about the bucket. Is it one user for the whole office basically? Well, yes, of course. You can do just one. I just was working with an office the other day and they had like 5 of them. They had a tax bucket. I think they had like a monthly write-up or bookkeeping bucket. They had a bucket for various things. And again, it doesn't affect your licensing, so have at it. Put as many on that list as you want. Just make sure that it's clear to everybody what the goal and what the purpose of the bucket is. It's not to not see things. It's to give you clarity on your own list, so that way you can take care of the day-to-days, right? The things that are popping up kind of here and there, and the more immediate stuff, the bulk reminders that you're going to receive because a certain date came around, or because there is not a defined staff member involved. That stuff goes to the bucket. But you have to make sure that you don't forget the bucket's there and that people are actually managing it and looking at it and reassigning things from it, right? So it's not a freebie. The work has to go into. You have to manage the bucket, but it does give you a really good way of kind of keeping the bulk of the work in one place and the day-to-day stuff on everybody's list as appropriate. Okay, somebody asked, when initially assigning work, do we have to click on the Assign Work button? Not necessarily. There are some options, some things that you can do with projects that are basically saying, when I create a project for a client, I would like this step to be assigned. And then you choose who gets it. The problem with that is that's the assumption that you're creating the project the moment there's work to be done. So in most cases, we know we have a client and we know we provide a service to that client and we can anticipate what we're going to do for them when the appropriate time comes, right? If you have an individual client and you do their taxes every year, we can make an assumption that we're going to do their taxes next year. So it's better to have the project there before they ever walk in the door or drop their stuff off so we can make decisions on that than the walk-in scenario where we didn't know anything work existed until a moment ago and now we're reacting to it and creating a project real quick. So there are some scenarios where you can have the project automatically assign things for you, but that's being dictated by other events, and I don't know if they're always more valuable than just clicking on the button. But again, that's something that we could speak to a trainer about as far as your needs and figure out some pretty creative ways of going to that. Okay, somebody pointed out that received info was spelled wrong. Thank you for that, Patty. I appreciate it. I'll make sure I go back and do that. Get spelled correctly. Okay, so another question, another really good question. Where's the best place to leave a note that everybody working on it will see it? There's a couple places. In the context of projects, though, what I would recommend is that when work is being assigned, that you use the note field on the assignment screen. So let me show you what that looks like. In the background, obviously, we can see my project, and I'm going to go ahead and assign work. So I can click on the Assign Work button. I guess I already have the job, but that's okay. I'll assign another step. And I get this screen. And this is where I'm choosing just that, the workflow and the person who's going to do it. Right down here, there's a notes field, and I can begin typing things in. And what this note will do is that if this is the most current assignment, it'll actually show up as the current note right here on the main screen for a project. Okay, there's another assignment here, but it gives you the ability to have, as we can see here, the note, whatever it may be, right here on the main project screen. In addition to that, and this is a little bit more of a trained process, there is a dedicated notes field for projects that will light up red if there is note detail there. So you can put a note in the notes area and just tell everybody, hey, if the word notes is red, then there's something there that you need to look at. In between those two things, I think you got it all covered. This button here for notes would be something that's always there and it's always visible and anybody can access it, as where the current note is really the note that was given to the most current assignments. All right. Very, very good questions. If you asked a question and I didn't get to it, I do apologize. I will follow up with everybody right at the end of the webinar here. And that's really about it. I want to thank everybody so much for coming. Really, really appreciate everybody's time.